And joining us now on the line from Vancouver, British Columbia, Niels Veldhuis. He is Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. Niels, good to have you on the program here on TVO. How are you tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. I want to just kind of try to follow the puck here as we try to figure out how public policy is made in this province and across the country. And I'm going to give you an example and then put a question to you. A few years ago, the Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, mused out loud about how expanding kindergarten might be a good idea. And so he commissioned former Deputy Minister of Education, whom we just heard on this program, Dr. Charles Pascal, to do a study on it. And lo and behold, Dr. Pascal came back with a study that said, yes, in fact, expanding kindergarten would be a good idea, and he gives a roadmap on how to go forward in doing that. Why, in your view, should we not be surprised that he in fact came to that conclusion?
Well, I think you have to understand what the motivations are of politicians, and certainly a realistic motivation for politicians is that they're in the game to get elected. I think previous to, I think, some more rational assumptions about politicians, people thought that politicians were self-interested, that they acted in the best interest of society. And that, of course, is not always true. They act in their own best interest, and their number one goal really is to get reelected, and that's what they focus on doing. They focus on implementing policies that they think will get them reelected or elected.
You don't mind my saying that's an incredibly cynical way to look at public life. Presumably getting elected, of course, is job one, but is it also not fair to say that they get into public life because job 1A is doing good?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that would be a motivation for getting into politics. I think a lot of people get into politics for that reason, but the primary essence of the game is to make sure that you get elected, and then once you're elected, to make sure you get re-elected. And I think that's a very realistic way of looking at the political marketplace, looking at politics. And that's really what the field of economics that I deal with assumes. And I think, again, that is a very realistic assessment.
Okay, now once again, let's take this McGuinty-Pascal example that I gave earlier, and academics and researchers such as yourself refer to this as an example of something called the public choice theory. What is that?
Well, public choice is a branch of economics that tries to examine the political marketplace, or to examine politics using an economic frame of reference, or using economic methods. It was started in the 1950s, and it caught on quite quickly, and some of the scholars in public choice have since won Nobel Prizes for their contributions.
And what does the theory actually advance?
Well, it's about trying to explain how the government sector works, how the government sector compares to the marketplace, and why we see some of the outcomes that we see in the government sector. So again, it's really about understanding why the public sector works the way it does, understanding the motivations behind politicians, the motivations behind the bureaucracy, and then examining whether or not the governments are capable of doing certain things that we want them to do.
Okay, we'll unpack all of those questions as we continue our conversation, but can you tell me this? Is this theory now, in your view, generally accepted in academic circles as being, accurate and legitimate?
Well, I wouldn't say it's generally accepted. I mean, it's certainly accurate and legitimate. Again, we've got two Nobel Prize winners that have won the Nobel Prize for their contributions to the public choice economics. But again, it hasn't gained widespread acceptance because I think a lot of academics in particular are stuck in this model that they model the world such as politicians and bureaucrats are really selfless and benevolent. And again, I just don't think that is a realistic way of looking at the world.
Is it possible to measure the impact of public choice theory beyond anecdotal evidence?
Oh, absolutely it is. I think one of the ways that we do that, and we certainly do that at the Fraser Institute, is to look at cases of government failure, look at where the government has failed in its attempts to try to influence the world. And if that is done in a systematic way, I think you can see that time and time again, the government failure occurs. It doesn't matter what department it's in, doesn't matter what government's in power, doesn't matter what political party's in power. We see government failures consistently throughout the year and throughout all levels of government.
Well, let's make sure we understand what you mean by government failure. Give us an example of something you would say is a government failure.
Well, a government failure really runs the whole gamut, anything from cost overruns to failure to produce a desired result, to not following protocol. An example of that, of course, would be something like the heating expense relief in 2001. This was a federal program that was meant to really help people in low-income situations deal with increased heating costs. So the government issued checks. A lot of these checks went abroad. A lot of these checks went to families which had heat included in their rent, so obviously they weren't dealing with increased costs. Some of these checks went to deceased people, some of these checks went to prisoners. Here's a case of a relatively simple task, and that is issuing checks to help low-income families, and the government failed miserably.
Okay, you say failed miserably, but let's take a broader look at it. Is it possible some people got checks and those checks helped pay for the heat during the winter and kept people warm?
Well, most certainly, but look, if you want to achieve something and you're wasting 50% of the money, that to me is not an efficient way to achieve your ends, and that's what we really see with government. It's the amount of waste in the public sector that we see in terms of the government trying to achieve certain things.
Well, you've pulled that number 50% out of thin air there, haven't you? I mean, where's the evidence that 50% of the checks went for bad usage?
Well, it's certainly in that case, it was a whole host of checks that went to bad uses, and then a whole host of checks, 25% of those checks indeed, went to families that were not even considered to be low income. So I think 50% is quite realistic. Secondly, I would then defer to academic studies, one in particular that was done by the European Central Bank, which compared Canada's public sector to public sectors around the world in industrialized countries. What these researchers found was that Canada has indeed a lot of waste in its public sector, and they calculate that Canada has about 25% waste in its public sector, so a substantial amount of waste right across the board.
Okay, let's look at, you talked earlier about the bureaucrats, you talked about politicians, and let's see how those two groups of people are influenced by the various incentives that are throughout our political system. So, for example, how are politicians, in your experience, influenced by incentives?
Well, again, we have to understand what incentivizes politicians. They want to get elected, they want to get reelected. So they want to make sure that they implement policies that get them reelected. I think we have a great case here at the federal government level today where the Conservatives want to get elected, they want to get a majority government. To do so, they have to capture more of Ontario, more of Quebec. And so many of their policies are geared towards those jurisdictions. Again, this is not doing what's best for Canada per se. This oftentimes has to do with what's best for one political party over another, and that obviously is determining which sectors to provide money to, benefits to, which regions to provide money and benefits to. So it's a calculus about providing a very select group of people or a group of individuals or businesses with some benefits, and then dispersing the cost onto all of Canadians or all of Canadian society.
Well, you say, you know, more than half the population of the country lives in Ontario and Quebec. So by definition, if you're doing something that improves the lot of people in those two provinces, aren't you in effect doing something good, quote unquote, for the country?
Well, I think, look, the auto bailouts is a great example. It's certainly benefiting, directly benefiting in terms of today, jobs in Southern Ontario. Is it good for the economy as a whole? I would argue not, and I would argue the literature says it's not. It's certainly benefiting, again, that southern region of Ontario, but in terms of doing what's best for Canada, in terms of making Canada a great place to invest, a great place to do business, right across the board, leveling the playing field, it doesn't do that. Again, it takes money from industries and businesses that are successful and transfers it to businesses that have been unsuccessful, that are more risky. And to me, that's not really a way to make sure that we have a prosperous economy, that we have growth right across the country. To me, that is providing benefits to a very select business, a very select region, and dispersing the cost onto all Canadian taxpayers.
Well, where would you put the soon-to-be coming to Vancouver Olympics on that scale as well? There are hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars being expended by taxpayers across the country to help make those games a success. The only people who are going to feel the impact of those are you know, people from BC. Isn't that a similar example?
Well, exactly, it's a similar example. In fact, I've been one of the only people, and this is going back right to when we held the vote, the plebiscite on the games, that said, we do not want to be backstopping this with taxpayer dollars. We do not want to be subsidizing this with taxpayer dollars. In fact, if we're going to have the Olympics, and if businesses are going to benefit, let's have them pony up and pay for the games. I don't think we should be holding games and backstopping it with taxpayer dollars. I think the games are great. It'll be a great party, but ultimately the people that benefit should be the ones that pay for it.
Okay, let's go back to that original question. We talked about incentives and how they work on politicians. How about how bureaucrats are incentivized to do various things? Give us an example there.
Well, I mean, bureaucrats are unfortunately not compensated based on productivity. They're compensated largely based on how large their budgets are, how large their staff sizes are. So the incentive really there is to grow your staff, to grow your budget, to make sure that you spend all of the money allocated to you. And in fact, it's even worse than that. Some of the perverse incentives are to make the problem you're trying to solve sound worse than it actually is, so that you're able to get more money, that you're able to get more staff. resources. I would argue that, coupled with the fact that most government programs, most government agencies operate in a monopoly environment. And we know well what happens when you operate in a monopoly environment. You get less innovation, you certainly get less quality, less customer service, and higher costs. So those two things, I think, lead to very unfortunate and perverse results for Canadian taxpayers.
Okay, but if you're a bureaucrat, for example, trying to, let's say you're in charge of a subway system. Obviously, you want to make the trains run on time, but those typical metrics of productivity, efficiency, and so on, and doing better than the competition, you know, there's no competing subway system here in Toronto. There's just one. So do those metrics really make any sense when you're trying to consider the usefulness and effectiveness of the public service?
Well, the problem here is, of course, there is no competition.
Well, that's because the private sector doesn't want to build its own subway system.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, look, the public transportation in particular has always been a monopoly in the government sense, and I think that's why you see some of the results you do in public transportation. You don't see a focus on the customer. You don't see a focus on innovation, largely because the government operates in a monopoly.
But why wouldn't you? I mean, presumably the government wants people to take the subways as well, and it's in their interest, therefore, to make them efficient, run on time, clean, etc.
Well, look, the way you incentivize people is that they benefit directly from the outcomes. That's certainly what we see in the government, in the marketplace. Profit, of course, drives people to do productive things that are in the best interest of the consumer, to innovate, to reduce cost, to increase customer service, not because they're doing it out of the benefit of their customers, because they like their customers. No, they're doing it because they want those customers to remain customers, so there's a direct incentive there. That's not the case in the government. The government has no direct benefit from people maintaining the system. It's an unfortunate part of government, but it is a main difference between the government sector and the marketplace, and one that Public Choice points out in its research.
Okay, but Niels, try this on for size.
Sure.
I understand how you're suggesting what the different motives are for those who are involved in public choice theory and therefore involved in the public sector. This is a bit of a tough time, though, to be defending the marvels of the private sector, isn't it? Given, you know, subprime mortgages and, you know, derivatives and all of the shenanigans on Wall Street that have, in fact, put the international economy into the dumper. You know, there's waste in the private sector as well. There's inefficiency there as well. Surely you're not ignoring that, are you?
No, absolutely, I'm not ignoring that. Let me come back to your first point, though, before I address the waste in the private sector. This is a great time to be, of course, promoting the market over government, because a lot of what's happened, I think people misunderstand. Much of this crisis, this financial crisis, has to do directly with government policy, primarily in the U.S. This has to do with trying to get people into mortgages that had no business getting into mortgages. That was, in a large part, the responsibility lies in terms of government policy. The Community Reinvestment Act in the U.S., Freddie and Fannie in the U.S., some of the tax changes in the late 1990s. One of the reasons Canada hasn't seen the financial crisis that the U.S. has seen is because we haven't had those government policies that drive low-income people into housing. Now, in terms of your second point, of course there's waste in the private sector, but we have a nice way of cleaning up that waste, and that is you can't be wasteful forever in the private sector, because your competition will come along, they will do things at a lower cost, they will do things that provide better customer service, that have more innovation, and clean up those inefficiencies. So the inefficiencies are short-term in the private sector. They tend to drag on a lot longer in the government sector.
Okay, I got about a minute and change left. I want to get into a couple of more things here. Is this, again, not a tough comparison? Because, frankly, the public sector provides a lot of services that the private sector either can't or won't provide, and that's why a lot of those services are there. So does it make these comparisons difficult?
Well, I can't think of too many services that the private sector wouldn't provide. The military might be one, although we do have examples of some private militaries that are operating around the world. Look, healthcare, that's done in the private sector in most industrialized countries.
How about education? The private sector want to run an education system?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the amount of school choice in some U.S. states, the private sector does so very efficiently. I would argue much more efficiently than the public sector. So in terms of the government programs in Canada, the big ones, healthcare and education, we can have more competition, we can have more private sector involvement in those things, and we can get better outcomes in both healthcare and education. So I think it's about experimentation. It's about not allowing those programs to run as a monopoly.
Okay, last minute, let me do one more thing. This is from Hugh Siegel's book, Beyond Greed. If some government is wasteful, he says, then all government is bad. If aspects of some programs in social policy are spendthrift, then all spending in support of social justice is wasteful. If one local government is dishonest, then all in government are corrupt. How do you respond to those, and I mean those kinds of comments which suggest that public choice theory are based on vast generalizations which at the end of the day really don't stand up?
Well, they don't. I mean, look at the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence shows a widespread government waste in the public sector, in all government departments, in all years, without respect to who's in office, politically speaking. It also shows that we have about 25% waste in government in Canada. So it's not just about using one example to paint all governments with the same brush. It's about systematically estimating what that level of waste is. And there is a substantial amount of waste in Canada because we don't have competition in a lot of the programs that governments operate.
Niels, that's our time. Niels Veldhuis from the Fraser Institute, thanks so much for joining us on the line from Vancouver.
Thank you.